Who here's a skateboarder? Oh God, right, okay, quite a lot, right, okay, that's good. Right. Just helps. Okay, so I've got about 20 minutes, take my watch off, keep time. So we're going to go on this is going to be quite fast, so bear with me. We're going to go on a journey. We're going to start in California, we're going to go to Milton Keynes, stop up in Sheffield and end up in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And we're going from the 1960s to pretty much the present day. So let's see how we do. Okay, so skateboarding starts with the stuff you see on the left, scooters, basically made out of roller skates, broken up, attached to a piece of wood. Then someone gets a bright idea and says, let's take this crate thing off the front, and you get skateboarders. This is the Hobie Professional Super Surfer skateboard team in 1964 in their uniform. Skateboarding at this time, very Californian, very Floridian, very Antipodean, a bit in Cornwall, a bit in South Wales. Skaters want to be surfers. And so you get this, so what this skater is doing here, this is a schoolyard bank in Los Angeles. What that skater is doing is pretending to be a surfer. And in this act, something very profound is happening, which is this skater is reimagining the city. So through the performative act of their body, this is no longer just a concrete bank in a schoolyard or a tarmac bank, it's an ocean wave. And it's become something different. Architecture has changed, the city has changed, their body has changed, the skateboard has even changed. So this is a sort of founding act of skateboarding. So we're still in the 70s. Skateboarders find other spaces to skate. They go out into the Arizona desert and find these big drainage pipes. They go into the backyards of Los Angeles and Californian homes and they find swimming pools, and if they've got water in them, they drain the water out, and if they're lucky, there isn't any water there in the first place, and they ride up onto the sides of the swimming pools. So again, this is an appropriative, transgressive act. A lot of this is done without the permission of owners or of authorities. Then, somewhere around 1976, 1977, the commercial sector thinks, well, wouldn't it be a good idea if we build purpose-built terrains for skateboarding to take place on? So you get skate parks. This is one built in 77, and then this pool was added in 79. It's called Pipeline in Upland in northeast Los Angeles. And what it's doing is it's replicating that pool that we saw out in the Arizona, that pipe we saw out in the Arizona desert, that swimming pool, but now extrematizing it. So you get these kind of extreme skate park terrains, and I'll come back to those. And then what also happens, though, at the end of the 1970s is that these essentially all fail. They become a commercial failure. Most of them are built for commercial reasons. You have to pay to get in. They all go bust, and nearly all of them get destroyed. And then so into the 80s and particularly into the 90s, you get this other kind of skateboarding which takes place, which is street skateboarding, which uses this move called the Ollie. The skater kind of jumps up into the air, and suddenly, rather than these spectacular terrains of pipes and swimming pools, it's ledges and flat pavements and planters and the kind of everyday architectures of the city. So suddenly we've got an act, a performative act, which can go out into the city and change it. So this thing, a handrail, is no longer an object of safety, it becomes an object of risk and kind of bodily pleasure. Another thing that happens in here is that the skater's body is kind of reasserted in this. Quite a lot of cultural theorists have talked about the 20th century and the 21st century as producing a kind of urban space that we consume largely with our eyes and with quite a passive body, sometimes called this sort of scopic regime. What skateboarding does, it's not the only act that does it, but what it does do is it reasserts a kind of fleshy body, a dynamic body, a body which touches architecture, which listens to architecture, which feels architecture coming up through the body of the skater. And this is one of the sort of important things that skateboarding then does. It sort of reasserts this kind of, I almost want to say kind of erotic engagement with the city, a kind of bodily pleasure of touching and feeling and emoting with architecture. But it's also conceptual. Skaters find different ways to map the city, to kind of connect things together. And they also start to enunciate a kind of critique of architecture. In some of the writing I've done on skateboarding, I talk about this as a performative critique, which says that it's not so much through words, but through the actual act of skateboarding, through the bodily act, a performance, a critical performance is made of the city. And this can be political and it can be cultural. And so it's a way of speaking the city, if you like. So question then is, well, what does it say? What's the critique? Well, one of the things it obviously does is it critiques consumption. It critiques the idea that we should be consuming the city with our eyes or with our wallets. And very often urban space today is kind of modelled around the shopping mall, the idea that we should just walk and we should buy things and we should rent things. What skateboarding obviously does is, unless you're a professional skateboarder, there are some of those but not many, that you are consuming without paying, and you are consuming without producing anything other than your own kind of bodily pleasure of using the city. One of the things that is also happening in this then is a politics about the right to the city. And one of the theorists that I've worked with quite a lot is the French philosopher, Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre. And Lefebvre talks about the bodily production of space, which relates to quite a lot of the work I've done, academic work I've done on skateboarding. But the other thing that Lefebvre, or one of the other things Lefebvre talks about, is the right to the city. And he talks, interestingly, about the right to the city in two ways. One is that it's the right to access, the right to use, the right to have kind of functional use of the city. And that's very important. So cities shouldn't just be for white, male, middle class city workers. They should be for people of all ages, all sexualities, all backgrounds, all ethnicity, and so on. And skateboarding, to some extent, does that. It opens up the spaces of the city to people from different backgrounds and says it shouldn't just all be of a certain type. But the other kind of right to the city that Lefebvre talks about is the right to become, not just to access, to produce yourself as a different kind of person. So this is a picture of the non-binary skater Marie Dabadi, and they are doing a layback in, where are we, in the Undercroft. And they, I think, are one of the sort of skaters that and there are many other skaters who do this, who use skateboarding to produce themselves as an individual. So the right to the city is not just the right to access that space, but for this person in this act to become the kind of person and to develop and to perform the person they want to be in public. And I think that's a very sort of important part of what skateboarding does. Just to point out also, then there's often some kickback to this. So often we see these devices, these skate stopper devices. So this is a space of democracy, supposedly. This is next to the Greater London Authority in London. You can see these things here. So this is supposed to be a space of democracy, but the first thing they did was exclude skateboarders. What else would I say? So particularly in the 1990s, I'm jumping around a little bit in chronology here, but particularly in the 1990s, there was an idea that skateboarding was kind of oppositional to society. It was subcultural. It was countercultural. It was, you either skated, as you see here, or you were stupid. And then you've got these sort of slightly kind of ganglandy graphics, skate and destroy, or this advert where the skaters are basically pretending that they're gangsters with their boards held like kind of, like guns in the searchlight of the police arc light. And they tended to be male. So adverts from Alva, Element, Supra, New Balance. The idea is that, particularly in these kind of buddy pictures, that skateboarding is primarily projected as being a male and masculine activity, particularly through street skateboarding. So I've written a couple of books on skateboarding. The first one I wrote in 2001, which is this one. So most of what I've said so far is in that book. And then I've just written this other one, which is sort of an extended development of that, which came out earlier this year. And what I'm just going to spend 5 minutes on, 10 minutes on now is explaining the difference of what's happened since then and what I've said so far. So the first thing is that I think skaters have changed. So skateboarders are women. So what have we got in this picture? We have got in this picture women and men. We've got people of different sexuality. We've got graphic designers, scaffolder, a policeman, a corporate lawyer, an academic. That's the corporate lawyer, just there. So skateboarding become more diverse in the people who do it. So you get people who are older, people who of different ethnicity, of different gender, get skaters with no legs, get blind skateboarders. So adaptive skateboarding is becoming a big thing, hoping that there'll be adaptive skateboarding in the 2024 Olympics in Paris. And then we're also starting to see a massive return to skate parks. So particularly in the last 15 years or so, we've seen an enormous return of skate parks of all different kinds. And some of these are very small. This is a converted paddling pool in South London that I was involved in. It was done for sort of £50,000. Some of them are DIY. In different places, skateboarders themselves around the world have built them, including Sheffield top left. Some of them are kind of medium-sized. This is my local park in Crystal Palace, which I was involved in building and a little bit in designing. Some of them are very big and very grand. This is a skate park built next to a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Luxembourg, so it's very beautiful. It's had lots of money spent on it. It's a lovely object. This is a kind of fantasy project, which is currently in construction. This is a £13 million multi-storey skate park. Under construction in Folkestone, will be open July 2020. It's had some problems with the facade design. I won't go into that. I did a tiny bit of consultancy work on this. These pictures I took about 2 or 3 months ago, something like that. What else is happening? Some skate parks are a bit silly. This is a skate park attached to a 5-star hard rock cafe in Mexico. So you can go and have 5-star cuisine in the evening and skate during the day with Camp Woodward next to it. It's very expensive, I won't be going. You have art projects. This is a glow-in-the-dark skate park done with a Korean artist in France. I probably should have had a picture of it at night, but it's got a certain kind of luminous. It's like the stuff on your on your watches that it's mixed into the concrete. So at night it kind of glows. You can just about see it starting to taste. You get skate parks which look like the ordinary urban realm. This is a stealth park, the Bussey in Milton Keynes, which I was very slightly involved in, done in the early 2000s. So it's a skate park that doesn't look like a skate park. It just happens to be a terrain that's good to skate. It's been quite successful. This is an art project in Paris done by Raphael Zarka and a French skate park company. So they've sort of turned a side street into a skatable terrain. This is Innsbruck, Landhausplatz, a big public plaza that again is a sort of terrain that's good to skate. This is Rotterdam, these kind of water plazas that are designed to flood at different times of the year, but when they're not flooded, they're meant to be kind of skated. where are we here? Glasgow, the Riverside Transport Museum, where they've deliberately made the area outside skate friendly with skateboard blocks and things as a way of attracting different people to the terrain. The Undercroft in South Bank Centre, which has recently expanded, which has, I think, had a really important role to play in discussions about the value of public space. So 150,000 people supported keeping skateboarding in this space. But I think, interestingly, when the public was supporting this, they were supporting both the idea that skateboarding might stay there, but what I think they were really doing in particular was saying we don't want it turned into another Frappuccino moment. You know, that we have enough kind of food and retail places and we want our cities to be diverse. Just sit down. This is a skate park from 1978, so this is one of the rare survivors from the 1970s. It's ROM. It's the only fully heritage listed proper scale skate park in the world. It's grade 2 listed. We got it grade 2 listed in 2014. It's currently closed because we need about $1 million or $2 million to refurbish it. What else? Skateboarding is going to be in the Olympics in 2020. I'm sure people will have different ideas about whether that's good or not. Two good things that will come from that. It helps if you want to get skate parks built. It's a massive fillip to that to say it's in the Olympics, so local councillors will understand that. City authorities understand it. It helps to promote skateboarding because it's in the Olympics. I think even more importantly, for the first time we will see male and female competitions given equal billing. So for the first time in the world, female skateboarding will get equal airtime as male skateboarding. And we're already, I think, beginning to see the uptick in female skaters as a result of that. Just some quick other things. Skateboarding's a commerce, so it produces enormous amounts of commercial activity. These are all skate-related brands. There's obviously lots of photography and film and graphic design associated with skateboarding. Lots of people write books and journalism and writing, so this is a little bit of my book collection. These are all skateboarding books here. So there's lots of artistic and creative activity associated with it as well. Some very well-known artists, including Deface and Sean Gladwell, bottom left. He's probably one of the world's premier video artists. And then finally, just to end up on this idea that where skateboarding, I think, is also now going is reaching beyond itself, where, in a way, the most important thing about skateboarding isn't skateboarding, but it's about where it connects to. So we're starting to see skateboarding being used to reach into schools as an alternative PE, so as a route to promoting mental health and physical health. But we're also starting to see schools, whole schools, which are predicated around skateboarding, like the Far Academy in Kent or Bryggeriet in Malmo. And then, very last point, we're starting to see lots of social enterprises use skateboarding as a way to reach to and connect, particularly with youth, not always youth, in different places around the world. And Dani, who's going to follow after me, has worked herself in Skatepal in Palestine, actually on bottom right, and has done a lot of amazing work in that area. So I'm just going to finish with a very short video which says something about this. This is from Skateistan, which is a social enterprise in Kabul in Afghanistan, and it just explains a little bit about how skateboarding reaches youth.
Children make up 70% of the population of Afghanistan.
Kids often only have, roadsides that are filled with rubbish and cars, and there's no place for them in the society here. So the result is they tend to grow up very quickly.
Girls aren't allowed to ride bicycles here, they're not allowed to climb over fences.
We had to teach the boys that no, they couldn't push the girls off the board and they had equal rights to be in that particular space.
To become a good skateboarder, you just have to lose your fear, and they don't have any fear in the first place. What Skaterstan is about is engaging kids through skateboarding and then giving them other skills. If kids grow up with guns and that's all that they know, then they're going to use guns later on, or they're going to use violence to solve problems. For us, it's more about breaking the cycle of violence.
We found skateboarding to be such a fantastic tool for communication. We get kids from all sorts of ethnicities building relationships with each other. So we've got Hazara kids skateboarding with Tajik kids, and we've also got girls skateboarding as well. People in other countries can see that these kids don't all want to strap explosives to themselves, and they're actually kids, and I think skateboarding's given them a little bit of confidence. We want them to be problem solvers, to be part of the reconstruction of their country. We want them to have a voice.
So we that was a bit of a blast. So say we've started in California, sort of 1960. Stopped off in Milton Keynes, and could be almost any modern city in the world, but we went to Milton Keynes. Quick glimpse of Sheffield and sort of the different kinds of terrains that are being built, and we've ended up in Kabul. But I think the thing about this is, you know, everyone here who skates likes to skate. There's something really amazing about skateboarding, and it's an enjoyable thing, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's a sort of moment that you get lost in. You know, it's the one bit in my life where I can think of nothing, you know, and it's just the pure pleasure of it. But it's also, and maybe it's because of that, or maybe it's despite that, or maybe it's despite and because of that, that I think skateboarding offers, and this is another sort of Lefebvrean point, a kind of utopian, for me it's a kind of utopian thing of how society might be. And that might sound ridiculous, but that's how it feels to me. You know, it's a place where people of different backgrounds come together. You meet people that you would never meet. You kind of compete, but you don't win medals. I mean, okay, someone's going to win a medal in the Olympics next year, but that's not really what skateboarding's about. It's about pushing yourself and taking risks and not being afraid of failure and gaining confidence, all the things that they were trying to do in Kabul. People of all abilities skate together. You know, you get professional skater turn up at a skate park, they skate as of equal with everybody else there. That there's a kind of glimpse of a flatness of a democracy. And I'm not saying that skateboarding's perfect, because it isn't, and there's, you know, there are bits about it that I've glossed over that are not so great. But it is a place where I think, and the skate spots out in the city and DIY spots and skate parks are kind of, you know, they're community spaces, and they offer a kind of way that people come together and talk together. A lot of talking goes on at skate parks, it's not always skate riding, that I think has a very kind of positive benefit to society that's beyond the act of skateboarding itself. And at the end of the book I talk about this as, you know, maybe it's a kind of magnificent life. Maybe it's a model for being in the world, as well as just something that's just enjoyable in itself. Yeah, I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming today. So my talk is, in a way, linked in a lot of ways to what Iain's just said, and I hope that I think it will be a good kind of combo with that. So I hope anyway. So my talk is titled Symbolic Expressive Movement: Why Skateboarding in the Street is Important. And in order to look at this, I'm going to first of all discuss this idea of symbolic and expressive movement and what I mean by that in skateboarding. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of public space, developing on what Iain's already said. And finally, I'm going to make a case for why skateboarding in the street is important. And I think that's it's a question that we particularly need to think about when skateboarding is becoming more of a sport, going into the Olympics, and where skateboarders are increasingly being pushed out of city spaces into skate parks. And this is not an anti-skate park talk either, because I mostly skate in skate parks myself, but this is about freedom of use of public space. So, what I mean by symbolic movement is that there are common physical movements and tricks within skateboarding that can serve as symbols for positive or beneficial behaviours. And I also mean that performing certain movements, when we perform certain movements, that has connotations and meanings that can be personal and specific to us. So it might be a particular trick that you've worked on for a really long time, and you have this sort of interesting kind of connection to it, and you have all these stories about where you've been practicing it and where you first managed to successfully do it and who helped you learn it and all of those things. But there's also like a shared or common symbolism that's connected to that trick, and this is something that I want to look at in this talk. And I'm going to focus on 3 movements and tricks in skateboarding which are fundamental movements in skateboarding. So they're things that are practiced by all sorts of different skateboarders. So the first thing is the push. Pushing, in which the skateboarder propels themselves forward on the board, is perhaps the most basic movement of all. It involves having one foot, usually at the front of the board, above the front truck. The skateboarder's back foot pushes against the ground to propel the skateboard and body forward. And then the skateboarder's back foot is placed on the board, either on the tail or toward the back truck area, so as to maintain a balanced riding stance across the board. As a sort of symbolic movement, to push is to exert effort, to compel or urge, and to keep going. In an episode of the Tony Hawk Foundation podcast on skateboarding as emotional therapy, skateboarders Peter Whitley and Alec Beck talk about the push as a form of symbolic movement. They describe the act of pushing with its forward momentum, and which is produced between the body, the board, and the ground, as a literal and figurative embodiment of momentum and agency. And this symbolism can be really powerful. I wanted to show this image of Lacey Baker pushing. First of all, because they have a fantastically styled push, but also because this image, which was shot by Sam Maguire, was produced explicitly with the LGBTQI+ rainbow flag colours, and was used to raise money for One Pulse Foundation, which was a foundation set up after the terrible Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016. So Lacey Baker's push here adds to this symbolism and creates a really interesting symbolism by emphasizing agency, power, and momentum, but also pride. Now, the push is practiced by every sort of skateboarder, whether they are a downhill rider, a street skateboarder, a freestyler, a pool rider. So it's one of the most basic forms of movement that really binds all skateboarders. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is the Ollie. The Ollie is the most basic jump trick that can be performed on a skateboard. And although it isn't practiced by every sort of skateboarder, within ramp and street skateboarding practice, it's considered a fundamental trick. The Ollie involves a sudden moment of force from the back foot exerted against the tail of the deck, which forces the deck to the ground. At that precise moment, the skateboarder responds with upward momentum of their body and levels out the board by leaning the front foot sideways and guiding it towards the nose of the deck. The moment of kicking the tail down against the ground, which achieves the lift of the board, has been discussed by Åsa Backstrom as the physical demonstration of decisiveness and explosiveness. In the act of performing an ollie, the skateboarder commits their body to an energetic leap that requires a high level of self-trust and the alignment of physical skill with a decisive mindset to successfully perform. And the third thing that I wanted to talk about is the drop-in. The entry point to transition skateboarding on ramps and banks is to drop in, which requires an even greater level of self-trust and a different kind of decisiveness than is seen in the ollie. Dropping in involves the skateboarder placing the tail of the skateboard on the flat top of the ramp with their back wheels and front wheels extending over the ramp transition. At this point, the skateboarder's weight is in the back foot and on the tail, keeping a skateboarder balanced at the top of the ramp. With the skateboarder's back foot positioned on the tail, their front foot is placed over the bolts of the front truck, which is hovering over the ramp. And when ready, the skateboarder transfers their weight to the front of the body and into their front foot, which sends the nose of the skateboard down towards the ramp transition. Once the skateboard wheels connect with the ramp surface, the skateboarder is able to ride out of the ramp. The moment of dropping requires total commitment to the action. It's a symbolic action of giving up control of the weight and accumulated skill of the skateboarder's body. What I mean here by accumulated skill is the development over time of understanding the process of weight alignment and transfer, understanding the transition curvature of different types of ramp, and how weight needs to be transferred when you're riding a transition. The speed with which dropping in occurs means that it doesn't allow for any cognitive decision making or processing of what's happening. So the skateboarder has to respond with their body without thinking in this moment of using what we call indwelt know-how. It's just literally the body takes over and does what it does. So these three sorts of symbolic action are performed and expanded upon repeatedly within a skateboarding practice and across a whole individual skateboarding career, to such an extent that understanding skateboarding is to recognize this symbolic, somatic dimension that bodies operate within. Momentum, effort, and agency reinforce the need for accumulated practice and determination. Decisiveness and explosiveness require and develop a sense of the skateboarder's command of the self, whilst commitment to the body and release of control values the somatic heritage developed by skateboarders through the thousands of hours devoted to even the most rudimentary tricks. And then we have this elusive thing called style. The qualities of the way a person performs that makes their physicality on a skateboard interesting, enjoyable and captivating to watch. Professional skateboarder John Cardiel describes style as a person's energy expelled on their board. In a similar vein, professional skateboarder Jason Dill describes how individual style can be so imprinted in physical practice that it becomes possible to recognize even at distance. He explains, "If I see someone pushing down the street and they're 3 or 4 blocks away, I know who it is." Skateboarders recognize that good style is linked to authenticity and fluency of movement. That is, it's not something that's being put on, but appears to look natural to the skater, and it looks practiced and rehearsed. In the same way that you can tell when a person doesn't know the dance moves that they're performing and hasn't practiced it enough, you can tell when a skateboarder's movement is or isn't fully embodied because of the ease and accuracy that they employ on the board. But individual style is not just about the individual. In skateboarding, it's very much about the collective. Skateboarders adopt favorite qualities from other skateboarders, trying on the physical gestures of movement that they see in others, and necessarily adapting it for their own body to make these movements authentically theirs. Similarly, when skateboarders interact in like a skate park setting or in a spot, they take cues from their connection to the space to decide how to move and what lines to take. And through peripheral viewpoints of other skaters, they kind of different tricks that are being performed in different parts of a park or spot can spark tricks in others as well. So creative self-expression in skateboarding is highly implicated in community involvement. Skateboarding is a socially engaged form of practice that encourages self-expression. But why are these things important? My reason for highlighting skateboarding's symbolic movement and emphasis on style is in part to make a connection between skateboarding and dance, and skateboarding and performance. Skateboarding shares these features of symbolic and expressive movement with dance and performance. Scholars of performance and dance studies have for decades recognized the importance of creative and expressive practices. The seminal work of Richard Schechner, particularly his theory of 7 functions of performance, as a term that covers the broad range of human physical activity, derives from decades of anthropological study into human creative expression in a range of contexts, including in the arts, in business, in therapeutic spaces, in education, in religious settings. There's no doubt that performance conditions the lives of all human beings and animals everywhere in the world. We perform to express ourselves and to be creative for the purpose of entertainment, to make something beautiful, to make or change identity, to make or foster community, to heal, to teach, persuade or convince, and to deal with the sacred. We are not robots. Our lives are not satisfactory when they are reduced to food, sleep, and work. Skateboarding is one way that people can satisfy some of these needs for creative bodily movement, for social interaction, for creative self-expression. So why are these things important in the street? The public realm of the street is also of vital importance to the lives of human beings. Public spaces which are free to access and belong to all are a place of social forum, a meeting point, a place in which the entire diversity of life can assemble, interact, and communicate with each other. This is Williamson Square in Liverpool, a site which the council want to actually reinvigorate to make it more of a gathering place rather than a kind of cut-through. And in 2018, they announced an open conversation, community cohesion event that will define how the square will be altered. Of course, not everyone is freely able to access public space and to express themselves freely in public for a wide variety of social and political reasons. In some cities, being a woman, being queer, being a person of colour, having a disability, amongst other things, can be extremely risky. Public spaces are always being redefined along with their status as public places, and in recent decades have increasingly come to be spaces of capitalist productivity. Instead of functioning as places in which it's possible for people to congregate, to meet, to sit, to debate, to play, to express themselves, public spaces are commonly conditioned by the demand that people within them have to be spending money or have to work there to have the validity to be there, that they must move quickly and anonymously from one place to another, from A to B and from work to home and back again, instead of gathering, assembling, meeting. And often this is built into the design of places or is part of the culture of a space, which is effectively policed by the complicity of everyday people rather than being aggressively enforced. The presence of anti-homeless spikes for preventing rough sleeping are perhaps the most iconic of what is often called hostile or exclusionary architecture. In this picture here, these benches have been designed so that they can't be slept on, but they've also been designed so that they can't be skated. So it achieves both two purposes, two horrible purposes. And political tensions around public squares are also quite subtly performed. For example, Republic Square is the main city square in Belgrade in Serbia, and it's been barriered off for years now under this conception that construction work has been going on for years and years. And though this is anecdotal, when we visited Belgrade in the summer, some local people feel that this is an actual strategy by the council to prevent people gathering and protesting at the situation, at the ongoing sort of economic problems of Serbia. And this picture on the left here shows Serbian activists removing barriers to part of the square in April 2019. In many cities, previously public areas have been sold to private companies who create what is sometimes referred to as pseudo-public spaces. Areas that look like they are public streets that are open and freely available to access, but are in fact owned by companies who regulate the space much more strictly than you would get in typical public spaces. So this is an image of Liverpool One, the Liverpool One shopping centre in Liverpool. And the boundary of the centre merges with the existing public streets, so that it's actually quite difficult to know at times when you're in Liverpool One and when you're in the sort of council-owned area of the city. In his book, Performance on the Contemporary City, Nicholas Wybrow documents artists' interest in urban spaces as a site for performance and art, which he believes comes from a perception that increasingly the behaviour of individuals in urban space is becoming restricted, in fact, to little more than the right to shop. As I know from my own practice of public space as a skateboarder and my research into public urban space as an artist, it is surprisingly easy to be radical in public space. This image is taken from a performance that I did in Liverpool in 2011 called Upholstered. Even the slightest divergence from what is considered ordinary behaviour is met with looks, comments, and physical interaction that, at best, comes from curiosity or concern, and at worst is made to control, prevent, or exert authority or power. And sometimes these responses are made to secure the smooth flow of capital, and sometimes they're made to exert gender-based aggressions. The authoritarians of public space are not always private security personnel or police officers. We also police and regulate each other through looks, comments, and physical interactions. Any skateboarder can tell you about a time when they have been involved in an altercation or aggression with an authority figure or member of the public. And I say that knowing that skateboarders are not always the innocent bystanders in these situations. And any woman can tell you about a time that they have felt at risk being out on the street. So you might say, well, this is all true, but why should skateboarders skate out in the street? They can go to skate parks, away from the private businesses, pedestrians, and the cars of the city streets. And so this question, why skate in the street, becomes one about public and private spaces. We have to ask, how should we define public spaces in terms of who and what activities happen there? And who are they for? And secondly, is it important for skateboarding activity to be seen and to happen in public? So I'd like to finish by giving you my thoughts about these two questions, but it'd be great to hear what you all think as well. I think the word public means of the people. That is, conceptually, public space is for all. Though it might not work like that in reality, does not make public space something to give up on, but makes it something to fight for. If we want to make more livable cities, we must hold on to public spaces and try to make them more democratic, more open, more diverse, to enact radical space-making behaviours that are genuinely of the people and representative of the diversity of social life. And why do this? Because we know from performance studies that people's primary learning mechanism is through mimicry. We perform and re-perform the behaviours and attitudes that we see and experience around us from the moment we are born. We need to see a diversity of life and behaviours and activities and interactions to develop ourselves in our societies. We have the ability to alter the activities that take place in our cities by performing differently. We can make our cities places for things other than shopping, work, productive movement, and we can make our cities places for things other than cars. This is an image of performers taking part in one of Willie Dorner's urban space interventions. So Willie Dorner is a choreographer who often works with groups of dancers and performers in particular cities, and they move around and create these images in colourful clothing. And then secondly, the kind of skateboarding that happens in cities is not just tricks in contextless spaces. Skateboarders are site-specific performers. They interact with the physical features and topography of public spaces, responding with movements that divert radically from the pedestrian. They embody new possibilities within a site. And the effects of this interaction are felt not just by the skateboarder, the person that performs, but by the accidental audience who wander past, the witnesses. To come back to the argument I made earlier in this talk about skateboarding's symbolic movement, the momentum, agency, and letting go of a push, an ollie, a drop-in, and the symbolism connected to all other skateboarding tricks, the expression of personal style. These are inspirational things, especially when seen and experienced within the everyday space of a city street. It's important that extraordinary movement of all kinds isn't sequestered and privatized, but contributes to and within the social fabric of city streets. And this is particularly important as well for women and girls. It's important for women and girls to be out there performing, because we perform what we see, and we believe what we believe is possible is by what we see is possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Dani. I'm going to invite Iain back to the stage, I guess. So we've got about 20 minutes for any kind of questions or discussion. So if anyone's got a burning question they would like to ask, just raise your hand and I'll bring a question over to you. Anyone? I've got a question.
I'm interested in you mentioned that there was a period where skateboarding in the street was transgressive, but since then you showed a lot of images of where skateboarding has been accommodated, whether it's in skate parks or like you showed the Riverside Museum in Glasgow, where they've designed the street furniture specifically for that purpose. Does that enhance skateboarding, or is there something about a kind of transgressive or co-option? I'm not a skater, by the way, I should have said that, but I'm just wondering whether, for example, authorities accommodating skating in the street scene, which to me has a deal of sense, especially just to actually have furniture that's going to take it rather than get damaged. But will that do something to the attractiveness of that space for skating or for skaters? Does it kind of take something away from it?
Well, I mean, so the question is about, if you design the urban realm for skaters in some way, does that take away the transgressive nature of skateboarding? And on one level, yeah, I suppose it does. There is a quality of skateboarding which is about appropriating something which has not been designed for you and making it into something else. And I suppose I tend to fall back on these things where, in a sense of kind of diversity, which is, I mean, like Dani, even more than Dani, I only ever skate in skate parks. So I'm a skate park skater, I'm a transition skater, I skate pools and bowls, I don't skate street. But I'm very interested in street skating, and for all the reasons that Dani's articulated and some of the ones I've articulated, I think it should take place. And I think the same thing occurs with those realms. So I think it's good to have purpose-designed spaces like skate parks that are almost like, I mean, they're not sports facilities, they're community spaces, but they're spaces absolutely designed for skateboarding. I think it's good to have spaces which are not designed for skateboarding, but skateboarding takes place in. But I also think it's nice to have these spaces that are kind of in between the two. So the Riverside, the Transport Museum in Glasgow is quite interesting, because actually that was done with Toby Patterson, who's a local artist, skater, and other skaters who helped design it as well. So it wasn't designed by a set of non-skating professionals for skateboarders. It was a collaboration between different groups, and the same thing's true of the example I showed of Milton Keynes, the bussy. That was a sort of collaborative process between Rob Selly, a local skater, an architect, Richard Ferrington, and Andrew Arms, and a town planner, tiny bit of me as an academic at one point, and lots of local skaters all coming together to produce a space that is good for skating but isn't a skate park. So my feeling is that the urban realm should have a diversity of these spaces. And one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is to write a sort of UK guide to skate parks, which is aimed at non-skateboarders. It's aimed at councils and charity groups. And one of the first things we say is that skate parks shouldn't replace skateboarding in the urban realm. They're not a substitute for that. They're a kind of complement to it. So just as you have a diversity of skateboarders, it seems to me you need a diversity of these terrains, and you need a diversity of the policies that accommodate them. And actually, I should also say, there are some places in the world where you shouldn't skate. I've seen somebody skateboard up the runway of Kidlington Private Airport in Oxfordshire while a light plane was coming in to land at them. And I've seen somebody, do a grind on the edge of a platform when Intercity 125 is blasted through at 100 miles an hour, and that's not a good idea either. There are times when I don't believe that skateboarding should be, happen in all places at all times. There are times when it shouldn't occur as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I don't really have much to add to that. I feel like that's a really good answer. but yeah, just to say as well, I suppose that sometimes skateboarders get into trouble for skating on memorial spots, for example, in city centres, and or even churches, with areas around churches, and there's lots of, public space is contested and contestable. There's lots of aspects about it that are tricky. I think creating more dialogue around that and understanding around that is important, and different people have different perspectives on what should and shouldn't be skated, but yeah.
Thank you very much for two really interesting papers. I'm not a skateboarder, but I'm a mother of skateboarders. I have 4 sons. So my question is kind of linked to that aspect, which is to do with risk. And what was interesting in your presentation, Iain, was the origins of skateboarding with the surfing community in California, and then moving into urban spaces, and then gradually over time moving across the world, and now becoming something that might be an activity that schools are going to get involved in as part of a sport. And Dani talked about skateboarding in public spaces, including in the streets. So as it's developed, I can see that right at the beginning, it was very interesting risk-taking behavior, and people enjoyed that. But as it moves into schools, becomes a school's activity, I wonder whether there's going to be concerns about the risk of skateboarding, the fact that skateboarders don't wear helmets, for example. Similarly, when you're skateboarding in the parks or skateboarding in the streets, I've seen skateboarders, including my own sons, skateboarding on the streets, where the cars are driving past. So it creates, as a driver, it creates a lot of concern for me that I might hit a skateboarder. And indeed, one of my sons fell and had a head injury and was hospitalized for 9 days, not wearing a skateboard, helmet, and fell down. He was partly drunk at the time as well, which obviously didn't help, 2 days before Christmas. But, so my question is really, is skateboarding, changing over time, and as a result of that change, is there going to be a greater concern about risk and about possibly legalizing, as you might do, say, with cyclists, or as they did with most cyclists, wearing helmets, and whether in fact that's a good thing or not, and does it take away from the performative aspect, the expressive, symbolic aspects of skateboarding?
Gosh, yeah, there's a lot in there.
So I'm going to address the idea of whether skateboarding is risky first of all, and I'm just going to respond to that actually. I read a really, really interesting research paper, and I can't recall the names of the people that wrote it, but it was really good because it was a study that was done in Canada, I think, and these two researchers researched several skate parks over something like 380 days, and they were looking at injuries that happen in skate parks, and they found a really low prevalence of injury. What they discovered was that skateboarders take calculated risks. So skateboarders don't tend to, generally don't tend to go beyond their ability. They go only a small amount, and they take calculated risk about what they can and can't do. So this study found that actually, although there's this perception that skateboarding is very injurious and risky, that isn't necessarily borne out in reality. Although, you know, I think that if people want to wear helmets, or with pool riding, in certain circumstances, I think wearing helmets is really advisable. And if you've not skated something before, I know most of the people that I skate with, if they were doing something that they really hadn't ever done before and they were really quite scared of it, they might wear a helmet, for example, or they might wear some padding. But once they're confident in their abilities and they perform something repeatedly, their chance of injury is extremely low. And I think that I think it's important to actually not be over the top about injury, and to look at it in a realistic way, and to have more research done as well into actually whether or not skateboarding is a risky activity. That's all.
It's not risky. I mean, people break their wrist, broken that. I've skated for 40 years. I've broken my ankle and leg once, and my wrist once. Cut my chin open quite a few times. But it's not, and that's it. That's typical. A few breaks, you know, and what people don't do is they don't snap their neck. They don't get caught at the bottom of the rugby scrum. They don't fall off the horse and end up as paraplegic. They don't run out of oxygen 12 foot under in scuba diving. They don't smash into a barrier at 80 miles an hour when they come off their motorbike. So compared to, they don't, as far as we know, they don't suffer from the kinds of concussions and brain damage that even footballers now, soccer players, there's a worry about heading footballs, the repeated things from that. So we don't think that there's those kinds of serious life-changing injuries, except when somebody's skateboarding on the street and they have an argument with a car and they lose. You will always lose that argument, or nearly always lose that argument. But skateboarding, you know, traffic accidents aside, has a much lower incident rate than baseball, for example, or almost any other sport. It's pretty minor. And actually, one of the things we say we do regular lessons for kids at my local skate park, and one of the things we say to parents is, well, you know, if your daughter breaks her wrist, well, in a way that's good, because it's part of she'll get over it, she'll recover, and she'll be a stronger person from it, and it's kind of part of growing up, and it's part of that kind of risk taking and becoming a stronger person through it. But what won't happen to your daughter is she won't break a neck. Having said that, most skate parks, when they do lessons for anyone under the age of 16 or 18, they tend to ask them to wear a helmet. So the helmet thing, I'm not so sure about. I skate pools. I wear every pad known to mankind. I go in looking like the Michelin Man, but I'm in my 50s and I don't bounce like I used to, and I can't run out of tricks like I used to. I have to slide out of them. So I need lots of pads, and I skate. You say, you know, people skate within 10%, only 10% over their ability. I skate, 15% within my ability.
Me too.
So, but there's, because I'm just old, and I don't repair quickly. But I think it's people self-assess, and there are some people who self-assess in different ways. But I mean, it's interesting when it takes. I live opposite a primary school, and they take the kids to the local skate park, and they insist that they all wear a helmet. So local park, just the local park to ride on skateboards, and they all have to. They're all under the age of 11, and they make them wear a helmet. And I kind of think that's not a bad idea, but street skating and transgressive skateboarding, and you're out there with your mates and so on, it's not going to happen, is it?
No.
I mean, the one thing that does worry me a little bit is the way in which risk-taking has become increasingly spectacularised amongst the skate media. So I think there are a lot of professional skateboarders out there who are doing some incredibly difficult, dangerous things now, and I kind of, there's part of me that's kind of waiting for something really unpleasant to happen on that. I don't know what you think about that, Dan, but you know, there's a kind of an escalation of higher jumps, bigger stair sets, you know, bombing faster hills. People do die bombing hills.
Yeah, hill
and
bombing is probably
that kind of worries me a bit, and I think social media feels that bit. But I'm an old git, so maybe maybe I'm just, that's just not my scene. Yeah, no question here.
Yeah, are there any new examples of sort of built architecture? And in terms of sort of diversity and encouraging people, I'm interested when you say you're mostly into transition skating at a certain age. Are there any really good examples of kind of built environments that encourage sort of more diverse skater audience, and which also sort of work well as a multi-user space, so that they're not just a corralled skateboard thing? You know, there's other people in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I mean, the Landhausplatz in Innsbruck, which is a skate, you know, it wasn't meant for skateboarders, it was meant for BMX, it was meant for skateboarding, it was meant for people to sit down and eat their lunch. And actually there's a bit of a memorial space where you're not supposed to skate there as well. There's a park in Philadelphia called Payne's Park, which is sort of again, it's a place to sit, you know, to go walking and walk your dog and sit and have lunch, but it's also meant to skate. There's a few of these sorts of things that are starting to occur. You know, there's a bit, the Undercroft at the South Bank Centre, you know, you get scooters and skateboarders and, you know, graffiti artists and street artists and, you know, street dancing and things like that all going on, and tourists, you know, all in the same space. So I think it is possible. I think the thing that often, sometimes it's about design, but I think just as importantly it's about governance and about the rules and the policies of what's allowed to go there. And very often things are prescribed by rules rather than designed out by physical objects as well. So often it's about kind of policy as much as about design. I'm hoping we'll see more of those kinds of multi-purpose skateboardable public spaces in future. It would be good to see, and we're seeing a few inklings of those.
Thank you. I was wondering, in terms of the creation of multi-purpose skating spaces, I was wondering if that would also feed into the kind of skateboarders becoming part of the creative class, the capitalist creative class, and therefore that would kind of challenge whether skateboarding really is that transgressive in terms of skateboarders not consuming their right to the city. So as they'll become part of the fabric of the city and therefore act as these cool subjects that would mark cities as distinct and unique, which cities are increasingly doing to compete with each other. So I'm just kind of thinking about transgression and how transgression itself is changing, and whether it still is as transgressive as maybe it used to be when skateboarding wasn't as accepted as it is becoming.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about skateboarding as a sort of subculture recently, and as a kind of transgressive culture or as a counterculture. And I think that always skateboarding is both subversive and massively not at the same time. If you take the South Bank Undercroft, for example, on the one hand, you've got a site which historically skateboarders sort of co-opted for their use and took over. You're never going to take that history away from the South Bank. It's always sort of embedded in it. But then now, because the South Bank has become such a part of the culture, sorry, the Undercroft has become such a part of the culture of the South Bank, it's also a tourist site to see, you know. Sorry, is that me doing that? Yeah, so it's kind of like the South Bank in a way is like a really good example of this, because it's like a sort of simultaneously sort of subcultural space, and it has that history connected to it, but at the same time it's like it also feeds into London's tourist culture. And I guess I find that really fascinating, the idea that we skateboarders occupy this space that is sort of simultaneously those things. And I think it's probably better to think about specific examples and to look at the interesting complexities of those examples rather than to kind of say, is skateboarding a subculture or not? Which is, I know you're not really saying, but it sometimes does come down to that question. And I think that you can't look at skateboarding as this like one thing. It's so diverse, and it occurs in so many different places. And now that we just can't think of it in that way. So.
Is that me making all that? Oh, sorry.
The final question. Okay. So growing up as a skateboarder, you're very inquisitive about your city, and you develop sort of a good understanding of what is and isn't acceptable in certain spaces, as we've discussed, as you both talked about, and you sort of use the city to its maximum potential to you. So you sort of you know where you can skate and when, and or sort of how long you might be able to skate somewhere before you get asked to leave. And I guess what I'm interested in is how that's actually quite rare. Like people, I see a lot of people thinking, sorry, let me rephrase that. I think people's like democratic ability to have a say on the development of their cities isn't necessarily very well understood in terms of the communication that people might have with local authorities, and how planning as a system is there to be democratic. And I wonder if skateboarding could have a role in improving the relationship that people have with local authorities and the development of their cities. So reaching a wider community beyond skateboarders, using their city to its maximum potential to each individual person. Like, does that make sense? It's quite open-ended, but is there any examples of that happening where it's used as an example? Or?
I mean, I think there are some cities where it's starting to take place. There are cities like Nottingham at the moment, the Skate Nottingham group, the Skate Southampton group, Long Live South Bank. I mean, the main example probably of it is probably in Malmö, in Sweden, where the skaters over a long period, 10, 15 years, have gradually built up a relationship with the city authorities. And I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about that is the way in which the skaters have I won't say mobilised, make them sound like one grand collective, because they're not, but they've talked to and worked with the city authorities. And I think one of the challenges for skateboarding is the degree to which it remains as a kind of libertarian, singular act of a lot of individual skaters, and how much will a skaters prepared to be collective and work in groups. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that. I mean, really, I think it's the sort of thing that SkatePal and those kinds of social enterprises have done, but also local groups are doing. And that, I think, is a new thing in the last 5-10 years of skateboarding that didn't really exist up until 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that is hugely positive, and it's certainly the case that I think that some of the issues that skateboarders are raising about the right to the city, the right to be who you are, what we value in heritage spaces, what's the kind of space that we protected, who should be able to do what and when, all those questions that skateboarders ask are absolutely fundamental questions about public space. So in that sense, skateboarders are asking the questions that are important to everyone. And that's, I think, why Long Live South Bank got so much great support, was because they were actually raising questions about the value of public space as much as they were, as much as they were raising questions about skateboarding. And what you guys do with Skate Pal and so on raises questions about community and identity and gender and so forth.
Yeah, and just to say as well with the work of Skate Pal in Palestine, in the West Bank in particular, there's a lot actually that Western countries and cities can learn from the attitudes of people in the Middle East, for example, to public space, because they have a very different kind of connection to public space and how it should be used. And the democratic use of space is, like, in some ways more interesting. And what we've found in the West Bank is that people are really encouraging of skateboarders in the streets in a really interesting way. And you don't get the same. I mean, it won't necessarily be like that all the time, and I'm not suggesting that that's the case everywhere, but it's certainly what we found. You'll be skating outside a shop, for example, in Ramallah, and the shopkeeper will come out and be like, kind of taking pictures of you, and it's really it's a very different. So I think one of the great things, I suppose, about the rise of skate charities is, and you've skated in Palestine as well, so you know that. I'll just remember, sorry. But the rise of skate charities, I think, is this move away from the Western city as this kind of ideal context, and actually looking at different kinds of cities in other parts of the world and how the public realm operates is also really wonderful. And skateboarders are kind of essentially going out to these countries, experiencing that for themselves, and then bringing that awareness back to their own countries, which I think is really positive. And there's often this sense that we are these Westerners who are going over there to do this charitable work, and I think it's really important to actually look at what comes back from and what actually how we benefit from those cultures as well. So it's a slightly side issue, but.
No. I think you're right to raise the cross-cultural dimension of it. Because certainly in Palestine, the skate parks not just used by the skateboarders, but they're also a site for intergenerational communication. So you see older people sitting around having a cup of
Exactly.
They're watching the kids, they're chatting,
Yeah.
So I think this idea of subversiveness is very much a Western concept, because the way skateboarding developed in the West. The ways we use, I've seen this in Jordan, for example, kids from refugee communities that bust into the skate parks, and they the skateboard, they share the skateboards, and kids from different backgrounds mixed together. So it's a very different manifestation, if you like, of skateboarding in non-Western countries. And the subversive element, it's got all the other elements, the emotional resilience, all the other aspects you talk about. But the subversiveness, I think, is less apparent. So you've got to look at it. We're talking about skateboarding in the cross-cultural context. I think really important.
So my thesis on this, when I did my first book on skateboarding, I wrote about skateboarding as a subcultural, anti-capitalist, subversive, transgressive act, and I think I got it wrong, or I think I over-egged that side of it, the kind of Thrasher magazine side of it. And that was certainly, I think, how skateboarders self-perceived themselves in the 1990s, but I don't think in the West, and I don't think I paid enough attention to the kinds of things. So the kinds of things that I think are happening now, I think actually were also happening then, but weren't part of skateboarding discourse. I mean, I was speaking to a colleague at the Royal College of Art a few days ago who's an expert in punk, and she was saying she thought punk music was subcultural for about 6 months in 1976. And actually, and her question to me was, when was skateboarding ever really a subculture? And I thought that was a really interesting question. So maybe the answer is a lot less than skateboarding itself might like to consider. And I find that really interesting, what you just said about subversion as a Western concept. And maybe it's a false ideology as well, that maybe skateboarding isn't quite as subversive and transgressive and as it might be. Doesn't mean it's not critical, and it doesn't mean it's not hugely powerful, but maybe the trope by which it's been represented has been rather monodimensional. Maybe.
Brilliant. Yeah, good note to end on, I guess. Thank you very much for everybody's time. I got a lot out of that, so thank you very much, Iain and Dani, and thank you all for taking part. Yeah, enjoy the rain.